Hello everyone, this is a video on Blade Runner Institutional Context, which is all part of the Eduqas A-Level Film Studies exam on Component 1, Section A, Hollywood Comparison, and Blade Runner is our new Hollywood film. Today we're going to be focusing specifically on institutional context. There will be another video on Blade Runner, social, political, historical and cultural context. Before we begin, I'm going to start with a couple of recommendations of books and some films that I think you should watch. So the first one would be, if you're studying Blade Runner for New Hollywood, is the book Studying Blade Runner by Sean Redmond, and also the BFI Film Classic series by Scott Bukatman on Blade Runner. If you're looking for just a general overview on New Hollywood, I would recommend reading Peter Biskind's book Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, or if you'd rather watch a film about it, they did make a documentary by the same name. And some good New Hollywood films I would recommend you watch. In a moment, I'll talk about the first phase and the second phase of the New Hollywood. So the first phase films I would recommend would be things like The Godfather, Taxi Driver, Bonnie and Clyde, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And in terms of the second phase, I'd recommend things like Star Wars, A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, or Steven Spielberg's E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And a quick reminder that the focus on Component 1 Section A is all about comparing the two films, the classical Hollywood film and the new Hollywood film, and considering the extent to which the auteur signature is reflected in your two films, or considering the extent to which they reflect the times in which they're made, i.e. the context. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, I would say that New Hollywood can really be split into two phases, and Blade Runner definitely occurs within the second phase of that. But I think it's important that we discuss the first phase because I think there are many attributes of the first phase of New Hollywood which we can see in Blade Runner. The exam will define the New Hollywood era as being 1960 to 1990.
Idiot! What are you, a moron?
But for many people, the first New Hollywood films would come towards the end of the 60s, in particular Bonnie and Clyde or Easy Rider. And the films that were made during this time were made by very young filmmakers who grew up on the classical Hollywood films, but also had an interest in European and art house cinema. So they were big fans of stuff like Italian neo-realism or French New Wave, along with all of those films that you'll be looking at in the classical Hollywood part of the exam. And these included lots of auteurs, names that you might recognize, so Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Sidney Lumet, William Friedkin, and Michael Cimino. And unlike the classical Hollywood filmmakers who had to really learn on the job, these new Hollywood auteurs may have studied film at a university or studied scriptwriting at a university. So they were approaching it from a more perhaps academic perspective. And they certainly would have been aware of the auteur theory by this time, and they might have even read magazines like Cahiers du Cinéma. So in lots of ways, these young filmmakers were probably consciously seeking that auteur status. And this first phase of the new Hollywood auteurs, they had some pretty big successes for relatively minor budgets. Films like Taxi Driver, The Exorcist, The Godfather films, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And not only did these films perform well at the box office, but they also did very well in terms of awards and critical acclaim. So a film like The Godfather, for example, did extremely well at the box office, but it also won Oscars for Best Picture and Best Actor and Best Director.
Hey everybody! I'm a stupid moron with an ugly face.
So this was really a win on all accounts by the studios that made it. And what's important about this time as well is that the production code, or the Hays Code, is no longer with us. Instead, it's been replaced by a rating system, an age classification system, and this is done by the MPAA, the Motion Pictures Association of America. And so this brings in a relaxation in censorship, and for the first time, filmmakers are now allowed to make films which have lots of gore and violence and sex and criminal activity. And we can see this in films like Bonnie and Clyde, which combines sex and violence in a really interesting way, and also in the final scenes of Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, which includes copious amounts of blood, and this would never have been allowed during the classical Hollywood era. Not only that, you're getting introduced to characters who are far more morally ambiguous, lots more anti-heroes in this time. less reliance on genre. These films tend to not be that easily classifiable in the way that the classical Hollywood films were. And lots of these actors that were big at this time came from the method school of acting and were going for a more representational performance style opposed to the presentational performance style that we saw in lots of classical Hollywood films. And as a general rule, these new Hollywood films were far more serious and realistic and gritty and focused on very dark subject matter. And the fact that they were getting made by young filmmakers and starring young actors, there had this air of authenticity which young adult audiences really responded well to. Now, the studios at this time were for the most part still being run by lots of older men, and they had to admit really that they didn't perhaps understand what these young adult audiences wanted. They perhaps didn't understand these young adult filmmakers, but they did know that these films were very successful. So they tended to back off and give these young directors lots of creative freedom. Add on to that the fact that these directors and these actors, they were no longer under contracts to studios. So if they were a young hot director, they could pick and choose the studio that they work with. So it was in the studio's best interest to make the proposition of working with them as an attractive one as possible. So by giving them creative freedom, by giving them the budgets they needed to make the films that they wanted to make. And lastly, due to advances in technology, cameras, sound recording equipment, these things were much lighter, so it meant that films could be made on location far more easily than they could during the classical Hollywood period. And again, that adds that level of authenticity, realism and grittiness that we see in these films. And even though Blade Runner is made after this first phase of New Hollywood, I think it still contains lots of these attributes that we associate with the first phase of New Hollywood. But this first phase of New Hollywood didn't last forever, and that's attributable to a couple of things. The first one is the massive financial disaster that was Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate was directed by Michael Cimino. He was the director of Deer Hunter, and Deer Hunter won the Oscar for Best Picture, did very well at the box office in 1978. 2 years later, the studio, buoyed by the success of Michael Cimino's Deer Hunter, gave him basically a blank checkbook and gave him as much time as he needed to make his follow-up film Heaven's Gate, and it was a disaster. The film was originally budgeted at 11 million. It ended up costing the studio 44 million. It was very, very long, something like 219 minutes upon its initial release, and it did terribly. Audiences didn't go and see it, the critics panned it, and it got no awards whatsoever. And because of that, it bankrupted the studio that made it United Artists, and from that point on, studios were seeing that this had happened with Heaven's Gate, and they were understandably very wary about giving directors the same level of creative freedom than they had previously. And the other nail in the coffin for the first phase of New Hollywood is the huge success of two films. The first one being Steven Spielberg's Jaws in 1975, which made 470 million at the box office, and the other one being Star Wars: A New Hope, which went on to make 750 million at the box office. And Jaws, and in particular Star Wars, were very, very different to that first phase of New Hollywood. Star Wars was the kind of film that the whole family could see. It was very clearly tied to genre. It had an uplifting narrative with a clear resolution at the end of it, very clear distinction between the good guys and the bad guys. And the other aspect that was very attractive about films like Star Wars to studios was that you could produce merchandise, toys, bedspreads, lunchboxes. This was a really lucrative aspect of making these films. And this doesn't really translate to films like, say, Taxi Driver or The Godfather. You can't make a Michael Corleone doll for your child at Christmas, or a Travis Bickle lunchbox, for example. Blade Runner was initially released in 1982, a couple of years after the huge success of Star Wars and Jaws, and we will need to consider the extent to which Blade Runner is a typical New Hollywood film of that particular time in 1982. Blade Runner was Ridley Scott's third film. His previous film, Alien, in 1979, had been a major hit, the fourth highest grossing film that year, and it only cost $8 million to make and made something like 87 million in its first year in the UK and the US alone. So Ridley Scott at this time was a pretty hot property in Hollywood. And one major way that New Hollywood is different to classical Hollywood is the studio system. Whereas before, projects in the classical Hollywood system tended to originate from within the studios. Writers, directors, cast would be on contract, and the film would be made by one studio, probably on the backlot of that studio, by contracted players. However, Blade Runner does not originate from within a studio, and its backstory is quite interesting. Blade Runner is based off of a book by an author called Philip K. Dick, very famous sci-fi writer. At that point, no films had been made of his books, but he had a couple of TV episodes based off of his work. The book was written in 1968. A scriptwriter writer called Hampton Fancher bought the rights to the book in 1975 and wrote a script, and then he gave it to producer Michael Dealey. At this stage, Michael Dealey wasn't associated with a single studio. It was up to him to find funding for the project from studios, to find a director and to find cast. Michael Dealey approached Ridley Scott initially with the script along with many other directors, and Scott, like many other directors, turned down the script when he first saw it, though at some point he changed his mind and he decided in 1980 to sign on, and him and Hampton Fancher sat down at that point and did several rewrites of the script. Still dissatisfied with the script in its current form, Ridley Scott approached another scriptwriter called David Peoples, who made some significant changes to the script. Eventually Michael Dealey found a studio to fund the project called Filmways. However, when they saw the final version of the script, they realised that this was going to be a very expensive picture, so they backed out of the project. At the last minute, Michael Dealey found 3 studios to fund the project, and they were Saran Run Shaw, an independent Hollywood mogul, the Ladd Company, which was financially backed by Warner Brothers Studios, and finally Tandem Productions. And Tandem Productions were quite wary of the projects and didn't have a great deal of confidence in Ridley Scott. And one of the things that they insisted on in their contract when they put the money up for the film was that should the film's budget run over by 10%, then they would take creative control over the film. And so to hypothesize for a minute what perhaps attracted the studios to this project, well, I think it was a number of things. Firstly, it would be the fact that Ridley Scott was attached, and as mentioned, he'd had a big success previously with Alien, and also they would have been attracted to the fact that it was a sci-fi film, and sci-fis were extremely popular at this time because of the Star Wars franchise. Not only that, but Harrison Ford, aka Han Solo, was attached to the project, and as mentioned, the Ladd Company was financed by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers had a huge studio backlot, which meant that they could keep the costs down because they were filming on their own backlot, but also that they could keep tabs on the project far easier because the director, the cast, the crew, everything was just on their doorstep. And so we can see, because of the genre, because of the style, because of the director, and because of the fact it could be filmed on the backlot, I think all of these things would have made Blade Runner seem on paper like a very attractive proposition to these 3 studios. However, once the shoot went underway, it became very clear early on that Ridley Scott was not interested in making a Star Wars style sci-fi, and because of that, Tandem Productions immediately started to lose confidence in the project. If you ever do any reading into the making of Blade Runner, it was a notoriously tense shoot. Ridley Scott was a perfectionist and he would insist on doing multiple takes. Apparently something like 15 to 20 takes was the norm.
I remember Ridley heard that they were upset at the number of takes he's done once when they were watching dailies, and Ridley got very angry, and in retrospect I think Ridley was sending a message back to them in his own way.
He also decided to scrap the entire first 2 weeks of shooting because the lighting wasn't correct. They were filming for 13 hours straight, often at night time. There were lots of fallings out between Harrison Ford and Sean Young and Ridley Scott. And in the background is the stories about things like Heaven's Gate, and the studios would have been made very nervous by all of this. To add insult to injury, when the first initial cuts of the film were shown to the studio, they were really not impressed. One film executive at one of the studios commented that the film got worse every time that they saw a new cut of it.
They would come over to see things, and the trouble is, no matter what we did, they didn't like it.
Took out things that I felt weren't necessary, and we had to cut the film down. We also had a legal right at that time that Warner Brothers had the right to anything from over 2 hours they could take out if they wanted to.
Things got so bad at one point that Ridley Scott was technically fired from the film, and this was not dissimilar to how directors would have been treated during the classical Hollywood era, and it still goes on today in Hollywood. For example, the film Solo, there were 2 directors initially attached to that, Lord and Miller. The studio didn't like the way it was going, got rid of those and put the film into what they considered to be a safer pair of hands, Ron Howard. As a result of the film going over budget, and as a result of the film taking longer than was expected, Tandem Productions took over control of the shoot, and they added the voiceover, and they changed the ending of the film significantly, removed the ambiguity about whether or not Deckard was a replicant, and this is the theatrical cut version of the film. However, you will be studying the director's cut version for the exam. Up until that point, all of Ridley Scott's films had been filmed in the UK, which meant that he could be the camera operator. However, because of union restrictions in Hollywood, Ridley Scott was not allowed to be the camera operator, and this was something that he found very, very frustrating. He likened it to Arnold Palmer, a famous golfer, not being able to use his own clubs.
Because of the union. So I'm not liking the union, that's the way it goes. And so being new on the block here, I had to learn the process of I couldn't use this, couldn't use that. You know, I didn't want, I'm used to being my own operator. There's nothing worse when you've done 2,500 commercials, and I know I've got a very good eye. In 3 seconds I can give you a setup, having walked in a room without you even seeing it before. So I don't like discussion. I know exactly what I want. I want to walk in and say, do it. That's the director's job. The director's not meant to stand there and consult with half a dozen people in the room. The term director means direct, mate, do the job.
And in general, the shoot was very, very stressful for Ridley Scott, and he later remarked that it was the shoot where he learnt to start screaming on set in order to get his own way. Blade Runner differs from the early phase of New Hollywood, where lots of films were being shot on real locations because of the lighter camera equipment and sound recording equipment. The majority of Blade Runner was shot on the studio backlot. And this made sense because Blade Runner was a sci-fi film, and locations like Blade Runner did not exist in the real world. They had to construct those sets themselves, either by adapting the studio backlot sets or by creating miniature models, which are used extensively throughout the film. The main set used for Blade Runner was the New York City street set, which was on the Warner Brothers backlot, and this was used a lot in the 30s and 40s for their gangster films. Due to an actor strike during the pre-production stages of Blade Runner, this meant that the backlot of Warner Brothers was not being used for 9 months, and that gave them far more time to actually adapt and alter the set. And that's part of the reason why the film's set design is so incredible. They had that increased amount of time to get every little detail working for the film's benefit.
The big advantage we had was the famous actors' strike that lasted for months. And the fact that, because I don't think we ever would have been able to finesse the designs that we were developing in the art department, finesse the technical aspect of it, had there not been an actor's strike. We needed the time. So consequently, we were in pre-production for 9 months or 9.5 months, which is as long as I've ever been on pre-production on a film.
And rather than create an entirely new set from scratch, as mentioned, it was the New York City street that was used in many of the gangster films. And what the set designers did was they actually built on top of that set. So they kept the old-fashioned buildings underneath, but they were putting new technological things on and having things like air ducts and pipes, etc., to the front of these buildings.
So look, we got to do it this way. I'm going to be on the back lot. We've got to do the best we can. We have a limited budget. I can't make things. That's why the idea of retrofitting things came about. It would have to be retroed to the surface of the backlot, which had traditional buildings, upon which we would put pipes and ducts.
And that accounts for the film's almost retro futuristic look, where you've got the old-fashioned buildings with the new technology on top. And this is all to do with Ridley Scott's layered style, where he builds up on top of things to create this mixture of old and new. And this certainly ties into what many refer to as the schizophrenic or the layered element of Blade Runner, where you get these two dichotomous aspects, things that would appear to be opposite, working together. So in the case of Blade Runner, we have, as mentioned, the old and the new. We've also got the replicants and the humans. We've got technophobia and technophilia. And the set design perfectly mirrors many of these themes and this overall feel of the film. And the studio backlots now, when you watch them compared to the films that were coming out, they just looked quite fake in comparison. So in order to get around that, what you'll notice on Blade Runner is it's shot at night time for the most part, but also they use lots of smoke and rain, and all of these things help to disguise the fact that this isn't really a street and that it is on a studio backlot. Smoke was also used for a lot of the miniature sets for that very same reason, to hide the artificiality of it and to make it appear as realistic as possible.
Shooting things that are only 10 feet away from you, and it has to look like it's 2 or 3 miles. The only way to build up the sense of aerial perspective at that time was to fill a miniature room full of smoke and create things blurring off and graying off into the distance.
If 2 towers were only 3 inches apart, but there was still a lot of smoke in there, they would separate from each other. One would be a little more crisp and the one behind it would be a little darker, and the lights on the one behind would create an edge, and it would just take on this huge amount of scale. And there's kind of a magical point where the smoke density gets to be so dense that the horizon almost disappears. That's kind of where you get to the magic point, to where you suddenly get all the separation between these little cutout layers.
Of course, as this is a Hollywood film, Hollywood films generally have a star in them, and Harrison Ford is the star of Blade Runner. At this point, Harrison Ford was a relatively newish name. Obviously, he'd been in Star Wars: A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, huge hits at that time, but he wasn't the leading man. He just filmed Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark, but that hadn't come out at that point, so he was on the cusp of becoming a huge Hollywood star. And Scott had heard good things about Harrison Ford from Steven Spielberg, and also had seen him in a couple of films, Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation and Apocalypse Now, and there was a creepy menace in both of those films, which Ridley Scott thought would work well for the character of Deckard. However, the creepy menace aspect that Ridley Scott responded to wasn't what audiences really knew Harrison Ford for. And in some ways, Deckard is perhaps a typical Harrison Ford character for that time. He's the reluctant hero, slightly cynical, maybe slightly morally ambiguous. But he's very different to the Indiana Jones and Han Solo characters. He's not the funny, wisecracking adventurer type. He doesn't have that confidence of Han Solo, that cheekiness of Han Solo. And despite Han Solo's character trying to make out that he isn't like a particularly good guy, isn't a particularly moral guy, he always does the right thing in the end. He shows loyalty to his friends, and of course he's fighting for the good guys in the Star Wars franchise. Compare this to Deckard, and Deckard is very, very different. Firstly, he isn't wisecracking, he isn't funny, he isn't confident. He's pretty much a quite dour, miserable, moody character. And when we're first introduced to him, it's very dark, it's very rainy, and in lots of ways, this sums up Deckard's personality, I think. And the biggest divergence away from the Han Solo character and the Indiana Jones character is that Deckard cannot really be characterized as a good guy. He's effectively a paid assassin, and as the film progresses, we become more and more uneasy about him retiring these replicants. We see them less as the baddies and see him more as a baddie. So I think in general, Deckard is very at odds with the star image that Harrison Ford had at this time, and audiences, I think, were expecting to see the fun, quick-witted, confident Han Solo, Indiana Jones type, and instead got this very world-weary, cynical, paid assassin who didn't really fit their idea of what a Harrison Ford film would be, and that could perhaps explain why the film didn't do very well upon its initial release. That is the end of Blade Runner Part 1 on institutional context. There'll be a Part 2 which you can either access by the link in the descriptions or by clicking on the channel icon.